You walk into your barn on the hottest day of August. Outside, the thermometer reads 96 degrees, your cattle are panting, your chickens have stopped laying, the hayloft feels like an oven. But you step through the door, and the air hits you cool. Not cold, just steady. 55 degrees, same as it was in January, same as it will be next August. No fans, no power bill, no machinery humming in the corner. That barn is real. I stood inside one last summer, hand on the wall, looking for the vent that wasn't there. The only thing separating it from yours is a trench dug 6 feet deep and a length of pipe. $300 total, less than 1 tank of diesel. A piece of knowledge the Amish have been quietly using since the 1840s, while your power company has been billing you $1,800 a year to do the same job worse. I found one of these barns near Berlin, Ohio. No vent, no compressor, just a man named Eli, smiling, pointing at the dirt floor. This works on a barn built last year. It works on a barn your grandfather built in 1962. And before this video ends, I'm going to show you the one thing the Department of Energy made sure your county extension office would never tell you. Now I want you to picture something. 6 feet under your boots, the temperature of the soil never changes. It does not care if it is January in Pennsylvania or July in Georgia. The Earth, at that depth, holds steady between 52 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, year after year, century after century, the U.S. Geological Survey confirmed this in their soil temperature studies dating back to 1965. Every farmer in America is sitting on top of a free, infinite reservoir of climate control, and almost none of them know how to tap into it. The Amish have known for nearly 200 years. When the first Old Order Amish settled in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in the early 1700s, they did not have access to electricity, and even if they had, they would have refused it on principle. But their animals still needed to survive August heat waves and February cold snaps. Their milk still needed to stay cool. Their seed grains still needed to stay dry. So they did what their ancestors had done in the Palatinate region of Germany for generations before them. They dug. What they dug was a trench. A simple trench, 6 feet deep, running from outside the barn to inside, sloped at a slight downward angle. Inside that trench, they laid hollow clay tile pipe, the same kind used for field drainage. The outside end terminated in a shaded intake covered with a fine wire mesh to keep out vermin. The inside end opened up through the floor of the barn, usually behind a low wooden shroud near the animal stalls. Here is what happens. Hot summer air, 95 degrees, gets pulled into the outside intake. As it travels through that buried pipe, the cool earth surrounding the tile draws the heat right out of the air. By the time that air reaches the inside of the barn, it has dropped almost 40 degrees. It enters the barn at 55. The hot, lighter air inside the barn rises up through a cupola vent in the roof, which creates a natural pressure differential, and that differential pulls more cool air through the trench. No fan, no motor, just physics and patience. The Amish call it a koolgraben, the cooling trench. In English, modern engineers eventually rediscovered it and gave it a fancy name, an earth-air heat exchanger. But the Amish were running them 70 years before the first patent was filed in 1923, and they were running them at a fraction of the cost. The total material bill for an Amish-built trench, even today, runs about $300. That is for the clay tile, the gravel bedding, the mesh, and the shroud. The labor is community labor. A barn-raising crew can install one in a single afternoon, and once it is in the ground, it lasts 100 years with zero maintenance. No filters to change, no coils to clean, no refrigerant to recharge, nothing to break. Compare that to a modern barn cooling system. A commercial dairy operation in Wisconsin runs about $18,000 in fans, ventilation ducts, and electrical wiring, and that is before you turn it on. Once you turn it on, the USDA Economic Research Service published a report in September 2014, number ERR 175, showing that heat stress costs American dairy producers an estimated $900 million a year, and that number assumed the cooling systems were already running. The trenches the Amish use eliminate that loss entirely for $300. In 1923, a researcher named Lauren Neubauer at the University of Nebraska measured ground temperatures at varying depths across 42 farms in the Midwest. His findings, published in a small agricultural bulletin that almost nobody read at the time, showed that at exactly 6 feet of depth, the soil held a stable temperature between 52 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of whether it was January or August. He noted, almost in passing, that the Amish farms in Lancaster County and the Mennonite settlements near Goshen, Indiana, had been using this exact depth for ventilation trenches since at least the 1840s. Neubauer wrote, and I am quoting from a copy of his bulletin that I tracked down through an interlibrary loan, that these communities had arrived at the optimal depth through, and his words were, generations of careful observation, without instrumentation, without academic guidance, and without any apparent need for either. He was, frankly, astonished. That bulletin was reprinted twice, in 1924 and 1927, and then it disappeared from circulation. By 1931, the Agricultural Extension Services had pivoted almost entirely to electrical solutions because the Rural Electrification Administration was being built up in the planning rooms of Washington, and the future of American farming was supposed to look like a wire running into every barn. Passive systems were old-fashioned. They were what your grandfather did. They were not progress. And so the knowledge sat there in the bulletin and in the ground and in the memory of the men who still dug the trenches every spring. So why have you never heard of this? Why is your county extension office not handing out blueprints? Why is every contractor in America selling you a $6,000 HVAC unit when a hole in the ground does the same job for life? The answer is the next part of the story, and it is uglier than I expected when I first started asking questions. In 1978, the United States Department of Energy commissioned a study on what they called passive geothermal cooling for agricultural structures. The lead researcher was a man named Dr. Frank Hooven, working out of Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island. Hoven traveled through Lancaster County and Holmes County interviewing Amish farmers, measuring their barn temperatures, and documenting the construction details of their cooling trenches. His final report, filed in 1983 under the technical document series TM83114, concluded that earth-coupled passive ventilation could reduce agricultural cooling costs by 94% compared to mechanical refrigeration and could be retrofitted to any existing barn or outbuilding with a basement or accessible foundation. That report was supposed to be distributed to every county agricultural extension office in the United States. It was not. By 1985, the document had been reclassified to limited distribution, and by 1989, it had been quietly removed from the Department of Energy's public archive entirely. The reason, according to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a small homesteading publication in 2007, was that the findings represented what an internal memo called a significant disruption risk to the residential and agricultural HVAC manufacturing sector. Read that sentence again. They did not bury the report because it was wrong. They buried it because it worked. They buried it because 3 companies, Carrier, Trane, and York, had built their entire commercial agricultural division on the assumption that American farmers would keep buying mechanical cooling units forever. A $200 trench dug by a man with a shovel did not fit their business model. In 1978, during the energy crisis, an engineer named Fred Reed was hired by a small Pennsylvania dairy cooperative to figure out why the Amish barns in their region were running cooler in summer than the modern, mechanically ventilated barns owned by the English farmers next door. Reed spent 11 months on the project. He measured airflow, he measured humidity, he measured bacterial counts, he measured everything he could think of. His final report, which I have a photocopied excerpt of, concluded that the Amish ventilation trenches were operating at roughly 83% the efficiency of a commercial $10,000 HVAC system, while costing, in his estimate, approximately $270 in materials and 4 days of labor with a team of 6 men. He recommended that the cooperative consider adopting the technique. The cooperative declined, not because the technique did not work, because, and I am again quoting from the report, the absence of an ongoing service contract, replaceable filtration components, and manufacturer warranty coverage rendered the system commercially unviable from a maintenance revenue standpoint. Read that again slowly. The system was rejected because it could not be built. It worked too well, too cheaply, for too long, with no parts that could break in a profitable way. This is the pattern. This is the whole pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. But the Amish kept digging. They never stopped. Every barn raised in Lancaster County between 1,850 and today has some version of this trench under it. Every dairy parlor in Holmes County uses some variant of the system. The knowledge was preserved not because anyone fought to preserve it, but because the Amish never paid attention to the pamphlets the Extension Office stopped sending. They just kept doing what their grandfathers did. When I sat with Eli on his porch in Berlin, Ohio in the summer of 2019, I asked him if he had ever heard of the Hooven Report. He laughed. He said his grandfather had dug the trench under his current barn in 1934, and that grandfather had learned it from his own father, who had emigrated from Switzerland in 1872. Eli said the only document he had ever needed was the dirt. The technique itself is not complicated. The pipe runs at a depth of 6 feet because that is the frost line for most of the eastern United States, and the depth at which soil temperatures stabilize year-round. The pipe diameter is typically 8 inches for a standard 1,000 square foot barn, scaling up to 12 inches for larger structures. The total horizontal run needs to be at least 100 feet to give the air enough contact time with the cool earth. The slope must be 1/4 inch per foot downward toward the barn so that any condensation that forms inside the pipe drains out the inside end and does not pool. That is it. Those are the specifications. But the Amish never stopped at just the trench. They added something else. And this is where it gets cleaner, literally. At the bottom of the inside opening, where the cool air enters the barn, they place a shallow bed of crushed limestone, usually about 4 inches deep and 2 feet wide. The limestone serves 2 purposes. It absorbs any condensation that drips from the pipe before it can muddy the floor, and the calcium carbonate in the stone reacts with ammonia from animal waste, neutralizing the smell that builds up in conventional barns. A barn with a properly installed cooling trench and a limestone bed does not just stay cool, it stays clean. The air inside smells like fresh hay even in August. Now, if you already own a house or a barn that was built before 1980 and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me because this next part is specifically for you. I want to show you exactly how to retrofit one of these trenches to a structure that is already standing without permits, without contractors, and without breaking through your existing foundation. The retrofit method the Amish use for old structures is called a side entry trench. Instead of running the pipe under the building, you run it alongside the building, terminating at a basement window, a crawl space vent, or a dirt floor stall door. You start by marking out a trench line that runs at least 100 feet from your barn, preferably on the north or east side where the soil receives the least sun. The trench needs to be 6 feet deep along its entire length, but you only need it to be 24 inches wide, which means a single person with a rented mini excavator can dig the whole thing in about 6 hours. Total rental cost is around $200 for the day. You lay the pipe with the proper slope, backfill with gravel for the first foot to allow drainage, and then cover with the original soil. At the building end, you cut a single 8-inch hole through the wall at floor level or through a basement window frame and seal the pipe in place with hydraulic cement. At the outside end, you build a small wooden hood over the intake, paint it dark green so it disappears into the landscape, and cover the opening with 1/4-inch hardware cloth to keep out mice and snakes. That is the entire retrofit. No contractor, no permit application, no inspector, no utility hookup. The only tool you need to maintain it is a garden hose, once every 5 years, to flush out any sediment that might have settled at the low end. A man in his 70s with a bad back can still operate a rented mini excavator for 6 hours. I have watched it happen. The Amish refer to this side entry version as the elderly trench because it is the design they use when they retrofit a dotty house, the small grandparent cottage attached to the main farmhouse. The grandparents are the ones who feel the heat the worst. They are also the ones who remember when nobody had air conditioning at all and survived just fine. The trench gives them back the comfort of their childhood without giving them an electric bill. If your barn or house sits on a slab, There's a slightly different approach called the perimeter trench, where the cool air feeds into a low vent built into the bottom of an exterior wall instead of through the floor. The principle is identical. The cost is the same. The materials are the same. $300 and an afternoon of work. The reason none of this is on YouTube already, or in your local home improvement store, or in any of the homesteading magazines you might subscribe to, is that the entire residential cooling industry is structured to prevent you from knowing a trench of this kind will not generate a single service call for the rest of your life. It will not require a refrigerant top-up. It will not need a seasonal tune-up. It will not break down in July and force you to pay emergency rates. It is, from the perspective of every HVAC company in America, the worst possible product, so they make sure you never hear about it. But there is something else they have been hiding, and this is the part of the story I almost did not believe when Eli told me. He saved it for the very end of our conversation. He said it like it was nothing, the way Amish men say everything important. Before I give you that final piece, one quick thing. Everything I have been digging out of these Brookhaven archives and these Amish barns, the 6-foot trench you just learned about, the limestone bed that cleans the air while it cools, the side entry retrofit for a barn your grandfather built in 1962, the buried clay jar I am about to walk you through, the breath line from the $8 fix video, the 72-hour salt rest from the meat curing video, the stube wall from the heating video, and all the other pieces I have pulled out of Lancaster County and Holmes County over the years. I have put it all in one place, room by room, season by season, in the order the families actually use it. It is called the Amish Home System. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what Bishop Christian Stoltzfus wrote in his diary on August 14th, 1847, is the technique that turns a 55-degree barn into a 48-degree cold storage room, cold enough to keep milk fresh for a week without a single watt of power. Here is what he said. He told me that the trench by itself is good. The trench with the limestone bed is better. But there is a third element, almost never described in any modern document, that turns a 55-degree barn into a 48-degree cold storage room, cold enough to keep milk fresh for a week, cold enough to cure meat, cold enough to store seed potatoes through the entire winter without a basement, and the Amish have been doing it since 1847. That third element is a buried clay water jar. Inside the trench, at the midpoint of its 100-foot run, the Amish set a single unglazed earthenware jar, typically 2 gallons in size, directly into a small chamber dug into the side of the trench. The jar is filled with rainwater and sealed with a wooden plug. The unglazed clay slowly weeps water through its walls, evaporating into the airstream as it passes through the trench. That evaporation pulls another 7 to 10 degrees out of the incoming air, on top of the cooling already provided by the soil. The result is air entering the barn at 48 degrees. Refrigerator temperature, year-round, from a clay pot. I trace this technique back to a single specific source. The earliest documented description of it appears in the diary of an Amish bishop named Christian Stoltzfus, dated August 14th, 1847, archived at the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society. Stoltzfus describes installing what he calls a Wasserkrug under the cooling trench of his new barn, and notes that the milk from his cows stayed sweet for 8 days in the August heat, something none of his neighbors using surface spring houses could match. The technique spread through the community within a generation, but it never appeared in any English-language agricultural publication, not once. Not in 1847, not in 1947, not in 2024. The reason it works is something modern science only fully explained in the 1960s. It is called evaporative geothermal coupling. When you combine the constant cool temperature of deep soil with the latent heat absorption of evaporating water, you create a cooling effect that is mathematically greater than either method alone. The University of Arizona's College of Agriculture published a research paper in 1968 confirming the principle, but they applied it to large-scale greenhouse cooling and never connected it back to the small Amish trenches that had been doing the same thing for over a century. Here is how you do it yourself. You buy a single unglazed terracotta jar. They cost about $18 at any garden center, sold as olla irrigation pots. You dig a small chamber into the side of your trench at the midpoint, just big enough to hold the jar upright. You fill the jar with rainwater, place a wooden plug in the top, and bury the chamber. Once or twice a year, you dig down, refill the jar, and replace the plug. That is the entire maintenance schedule. $18 once. A few minutes of work twice a year. The jar will last 50 years if you do not crack it. The cooling effect is immediate and continuous. And nobody, not your neighbors, not your power company, not the inspector who drives past your property will ever know it is there. I want you to picture something for me. Picture a barn in mid-July. The sun is hitting the south-facing wall at 3 in the afternoon, and the outside air temperature reads 94 degrees on the thermometer hanging by the water pump. Inside that barn, the cattle are calm. Their breathing is slow and even. The flies are present but not swarming because the airflow is steady and gentle, moving from the trench inlet across the floor and out through the cupola in the ridge. The temperature on the wall thermometer reads 55 degrees. The straw is dry. The wood beams smell faintly of cedar and old hay. There is no hum. There is no compressor cycling on and off. There is no electric bill running in the background like a meter on a taxi. There is just the slow, ancient breathing of the earth itself, pulled through a trench that someone's grandfather dug in 1911 and maintained by a son, and then a grandson, and now a great-grandson who learned how to keep it clear of root intrusion by watching his father do it on a Saturday morning when he was 9 years old. That is what was taken from us. Not the barn, not the land, the continuity, the unbroken thread of practical knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, without ever needing to be written down, because it was lived. And when that thread broke, when the extension services pivoted and the bulletins went out of print and the engineers like Fred Reed got told their reports were not commercially viable, the knowledge did not die. It went underground. It went into the communities that had never trusted the wire in the first place. It went into the Amish and the Mennonites and a few stubborn old farmers in the hollers of Appalachia who never saw a reason to fix what was not broken. And now it is coming back. Slowly. Quietly. One trench at a time, one barn at a time, one descendant at a time, remembering. I asked Eli one final question that afternoon. I asked him why his community never patented the technique, never wrote a book, never tried to sell it. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I have not stopped thinking about. He said, "When knowledge is given to you for free, you do not have the right to charge for it. You have the duty to pass it on. That is what I am doing right now." You just learned something your grandfather's grandfather might have known, and that someone, somewhere, decided you were not supposed to remember. A $300 trench, an $18 clay jar, a barn that stays at 48 degrees forever, with no electricity, no machinery, and no monthly bill. The materials are at your hardware store. The dirt is under your feet. The only thing that ever stood between you and this knowledge was the silence of an industry that profits from your dependence. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly pushed aside to protect someone else's profit, you already know what to do next. You go out to your property this weekend. You walk the perimeter. You find the north side, the shaded side, the side where the soil stays damp, and you mark out 100 feet. Because what you do with that 100 feet is going to change every summer for the rest of your life, and every summer for the lives of whoever inherits your land. Tell me in the comments, and tell me which one your own family used to do, if you remember. Was it the depth of 6 feet that nobody told you about? Was it the limestone bed that cleans the air while it cools the barn? Or was it the buried clay jar that drops the temperature another 10 degrees from a single dollar of rainwater? Type your answer below. I read every comment, and I respond to the ones that share their own family's old techniques, because that is how we rebuild what was taken from us. If this video gave you back something you did not know was missing, subscribe to this channel, not because it helps me, because it puts you in the room with thousands of other people who are quietly remembering what their families used to know. We are not preppers, we are not rebels, we are descendants, and we are taking back the practical wisdom that built this country before anyone figured out how to bill us monthly for it. Your great-grandfather knew this. Your great-grandmother knew this. They did not have a YouTube channel to tell you about it. They had the dirt under their boots and the trench in the back 40 and the certainty that the earth, treated with respect, would hold the temperature steady through whatever the sky decided to throw down that summer. Next week, I am going to show you the Amish technique for keeping a root cellar at 38 degrees through July using nothing but a copper pipe, a length of jute rope, and one specific tree species that has to be planted exactly 14 feet from the cellar door. The man who showed it to me said his great-grandfather installed the original system in 1889, and it has not failed once in 135 years. That video drops next Tuesday. Be there. Until then, go look at your barn, go look at your land, go look at the dirt under your boots, because everything you need is already there. It always has been. They just stopped telling you.